commission.
Whoa, that's a nasty one.
Do
I
you
don't
consider it an
know.
attack?
Elon has not called me to ask for help on that one. But no, that's a tough thing. I don't think it's right. No, I don't think it's right. I don't see, how they can do that. No. I'll speak about it later. I'm going to get a full report on it. Look, Europe has to be very careful. They're doing a lot of things. We want to keep Europe Europe. Europe is going in some bad directions. It's very bad for the people. We don't want Europe to change so much. They're going in some very bad directions. That was a big...
Listen to him carefully. Watch how the authoritarian impulse reveals itself through the barely coherent rambling about Europe going in some bad directions, and how we don't want Europe to change so much, as if an entire continent of democracies somehow needs the paternal blessing of a man who attempted to overthrow his own government just years ago. What you've just witnessed is not merely a political disagreement about regulatory policy. This is the opening salvo in what scholars of democratic backsliding would recognize as techno-authoritarianism, wrapping itself in the stolen garments of free speech absolutism, and the stakes here extend far beyond a $140 million fine against Elon Musk's ex for SOAS, misleading use of a blue checkmark to identify verified users, a poorly functioning advertising repository, and a failure to provide effective data access for researchers under the European Union's Digital Services Act. The bombshell that nobody is talking about loudly enough is that we are watching in real time the attempted demolition of the most ambitious democratic experiment in platform accountability that the world has ever seen, because the Digital Services Act, passed in 2022, requires tech companies, including American giants like Meta and X, to remove illegal content and provide transparency about their content moderation. And this absolutely terrifies the billionaire oligarchs who have spent the past decade constructing digital fiefdoms where they operate as unaccountable sovereigns over the information ecosystem that shapes democratic discourse. Trump's defense of Musk here is no accident. Musk wrote on X that the EU should be abolished and sovereignty returned to individual countries so that governments can better represent their people, which should send chills down the spine of anyone who understands that this rhetoric about sovereignty is simply cover for the desire to fragment democratic regulatory power so that no authority can ever check the concentrated power of platform monopolists. And here's where it gets even more explosive, because what Trump is framing as a defense of American companies against foreign overreach is actually something far more sinister. It's the weaponization of nationalist rhetoric to protect the ability of social media platforms to serve as vectors for disinformation, hate speech, and the kind of algorithmic manipulation that corrodes democratic deliberation itself. The interest in free speech appears focused on boosting far-right parties, while European officials argue the issue is about ensuring social media companies take steps to mitigate disinformation and foreign interference that undermine electoral integrity and civil discourse. Notice how Trump and his allies never actually engage with the substance of what the Digital Services Act requires. They simply invoke the sacred totem of free speech, as if requiring transparency in advertising repositories or preventing deceptive verification systems somehow constitutes censorship, when in reality these are precisely the kinds of baseline accountability measures that any functioning democracy should demand from platforms that have become the de facto public square. The intellectual dishonesty here is staggering, and we need to call it what it is, because Vice President J.D. Vance, speaking at the Munich Security Conference, accused EU commissars of suppressing free speech and calling Trump Washington's new sheriff, slammed attempts to moderate speech on social media, deploying the language of liberation while actually advocating for a digital landscape where the most powerful can operate without constraint. This is Orwellian doublespeak of the highest order, wrapping authoritarian impulsors in the rhetoric of freedom. The real question Vance refuses to answer is this: whose freedom are we talking about? The freedom of Elon Musk to run a platform where disinformation propagators have been reinstated, moderation has been reduced, and verification badges have been sold to terrorists and misinformation superspreaders, or the freedom of citizens to participate in democratic discourse without being manipulated by opaque algorithmic systems designed to maximize engagement through outrage and division? But wait, because it gets even worse, and you need to understand the full scope of what's happening here. Musk was a prominent supporter of Trump's campaign, and spent several months this past spring serving as an administration advisor and the public face of the Department of Government Efficiency Initiative, which means we're not dealing with a principled disagreement about regulatory philosophy. We're dealing with the consolidation of power between political authoritarians and tech oligarchs, who recognize that their interests are perfectly aligned in dismantling any institutional check on their ability to shape information flows. Musk wants to replicate worldwide what he has done in the US, and is already meddling in European politics. And when Trump says we don't want Europe to change, what he actually means is, we don't want Europe to establish a regulatory framework that might inspire similar reforms in the United States. The historical parallel here should be obvious to anyone who has studied the rise of fascism in the 20th century, because what we're witnessing is the alliance between concentrated economic power and reactionary political movements that characterizes every descent into authoritarianism. Hannah Arendt wrote about how totalitarian movements destroy the very fabric of factual reality as a prerequisite to total domination, and the dismantling of content moderation standards is precisely that project dressed up in libertarian rhetoric. When Musk urged attendees at an Alternative für Deutschland rally to move beyond Germany's culpability and history in the Holocaust, this wasn't some isolated gaffe. This is the logical endpoint of a worldview that sees accountability itself as oppressive, where billionaires should be free to amplify fascist movements and historical revisionism without consequence. And let's talk about the absolutely crucial point that the mainstream media keeps missing because they're trapped in both sides, which is that the broadsides, often couched in lofty rhetoric about protecting democracy, may also have a more prosaic motivation. Less regulation could free Silicon Valley companies from burdensome requirements and spare them billions of dollars of fines. Follow the money here, because this entire moral panic about European censorship is actually just a very expensive lobbying campaign, dressed up as a civilizational conflict. The Trump administration has consistently argued that the EU unfairly targets U.S. technology companies with severe financial penalties and burdensome regulations, equating these measures to tariffs that justify trade retaliation, and U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick stated that the EU must revise its digital regulations to secure a deal aimed at reducing steel and aluminum tariffs, Tekanu, which reveals the game entirely because suddenly we're linking fundamental questions about democratic discourse to trade policy, meaning tech platforms have successfully leveraged their economic importance to hold democratic governance itself hostage. Now here's the bombshell within the bombshell that should radicalize anyone who cares about democracy, because what the Digital Services Act actually does is remarkably modest and incredibly necessary. The Digital Services Act aims to force major internet platforms to do more to tackle the spread of illegal content and other societal risks on their services in the EU, or else risk billions of euros in fines. It aims to end an era in which tech companies have essentially regulated themselves. Think about what we're calling censorship here, requiring platforms to be transparent about their advertising practices, to provide researchers with access to data so we can actually study how these systems affect society, and to not deliberately design interfaces that deceive users about who they're interacting with. These are not radical impositions. These are the bare minimum requirements for democratic accountability over institutions that exercise unprecedented power over public discourse. The European approach to content moderation reflects a fundamentally different philosophical understanding of freedom than the absolutist position that Musk and Trump pretend to champion, because in the EU, spreading false or misleading information is not generally illegal. Freedom of expression includes the right to express incorrect views, and the distinction between fake news and legitimate opinion is often contested. But what Europe recognizes, and what the American libertarian techno-utopians refuse to acknowledge, is that corporate social media's business model rewards and profits from disinformation. Since social media companies make money by keeping users engaged, they have a vested interest in gearing algorithms towards promoting content which elicits virulent support and deep outrage. This is not a marketplace of ideas. This is a marketplace of engagement, where truth and lies compete on unequal terms, because lies are more emotionally compelling, and therefore more profitable. And we need to confront the staggering hypocrisy at the heart of this entire discourse, because these supposed champions of free speech have no problem whatsoever with platforms removing content when it serves their interests. The issue is not content moderation per se. The issue is who decides and according to what principles, and what Musk and Trump want is a system where billionaires and their political allies make those decisions without any democratic input or oversight. Thierry Breton appeared to attempt to use the DSA to censor American political speech in the lead-up to the 2024 presidential election, issuing his warning to Elon Musk ahead of an interview with President Trump on X because of the potential spillovers into the EU, which is the example that conservatives keep citing as proof of tyrannical overreach. But let's be clear about what actually happened. A regulator reminded a platform of its existing obligations under democratically enacted law in advance of an event that would generate massive traffic, and this is being characterized as censorship, because it dared to suggest that even Donald Trump is subject to the same rules as everyone else. The real threat to free speech isn't coming from Brussels, it's coming from the concentration of communicative power in the hands of unaccountable oligarchs who can unilaterally decide which voices get amplified and which get suppressed based on their personal whims and financial interests. The issue is not freedom of expression, but whether the unchecked political power of tech billionaires undermines democracies, and when Musk's support for the far-right alternative for Germany on X is in effect indirect election financing, as other German parties would need to pay X a fortune in advertising to get the same level of exposure. We're dealing with a form of oligarchic power that makes a mockery of democratic equality. This is not free speech, this is purchase speech, and the refusal to regulate it is not libertarianism, it's plutocracy. Here's what makes this moment so dangerous and why we cannot afford to lose this fight. The willingness to take on Musk's business empire could serve as a critical test of the EU's determination, especially in light of President Trump's previous threats of tariffs over the bloc's fines against U.S. technology giants, highlighting a growing division over digital sovereignty as Europe strives to establish itself as the global authority for digital regulation, with experts warning this direct punitive action against Musk's businesses carries the risk of U.S. retaliation. We are watching the emergence of what scholars might call techno-imperialism, where American tech platforms backed by American state power are attempting to override the democratic decisions of sovereign nations about how to govern the digital public sphere within their own borders. The discourse about American values here is particularly galling because the First Amendment was designed to protect citizens from government censorship, not to prevent democratic governments from regulating massive corporate entities that have more influence over public discourse than any government in history. Trump's comment that we want to keep Europe Europe would be laughable if it weren't so sinister, because what does that even mean? Europe is moving toward greater democratic accountability over tech platforms, toward protecting citizens from manipulation and disinformation, toward ensuring that the digital public sphere serves democratic values rather than simply maximizing engagement and profit. If keeping Europe Europe means keeping it vulnerable to the kind of information warfare that has destabilized American democracy, then what Trump is really saying is that he wants Europe to suffer the same democratic decay that has empowered him. The interest in free speech, which includes attacks on European protections against election interference from malign actors such as Russia, appears focused on boosting far-right parties, and we need to be absolutely clear that this is not a bug in Trump's position, it's the entire point. The philosopher Jürgen Habermas wrote about the structural transformation of the public sphere and how commercial imperatives can colonize spaces of democratic deliberation, turning citizens into consumers and debate into spectacle. What Habermas described in the context of 20th century mass media has been amplified 1,000-fold in the age of algorithmic social media, where the very architecture of communication is designed to bypass rational deliberation in favor of emotional manipulation. The Digital Services Act represents an attempt to reassert democratic control over this colonized public sphere, to say that we as citizens have the right to establish rules for how platforms that mediate our collective discourse must operate. When Trump and Musk attack this project, they're not defending freedom, they're defending oligarchy, and we cannot let them get away with framing this as a conflict between America and Europe, because this is not a confrontation between the US and Europe, but between certain tech oligarchs and democratic governance. There are millions of Americans who would welcome similar regulations of tech platforms, who are sick of being manipulated by algorithmic systems they don't understand and can't control, who recognize that what poses as a free marketplace of ideas is actually a rigged game where bad actors and bad faith arguments consistently win because they're better at gaming the engagement metrics that determine visibility. The fact that American democracy has been too captured by tech industry lobbying to pass similar legislation doesn't make the European approach wrong, it makes the American approach a cautionary tale. What Trump is doing in this clip by calling the EU fine a nasty one and ominously promising to get a full report on it is signaling that he will use the power of the American state to retaliate against European attempts to regulate American companies, which is an extraordinary assertion of extraterritorial authority. Vice President Vance hinted at leveraging federal government power to deal with DSA requirements, responding affirmatively when asked whether American support of NATO could hinge on whether the EU regulated Elon Musk's Platform X, saying if NATO wants us to continue supporting them, why don't you respect American values and respect free speech? It's insane that we would support a military alliance if that military alliance isn't going to be pro-free speech. This is blackmail. This is using America's security guarantee to Europe to extort regulatory concessions for billionaire Trump allies, and it represents a form of corruption so brazen that it would have been unthinkable in any previous administration. The pattern here is clear, and it's been clear for years to anyone paying attention. The right wing's commitment to free speech is entirely tactical and selective. They scream about censorship when platforms remove misinformation and hate speech, but they have no problem with Florida and Texas passing laws to compel platforms to host content they find objectionable. They celebrate when Musk bans journalists who report critically on him. They applaud when DeSantis uses state power to punish Disney for expressing corporate opposition to discriminatory legislation. The principle isn't freedom of expression. The principle is that the right should be able to say whatever they want on any platform they want, while their opponents can be silenced through intimidation, harassment, and state power. This is not a coherent philosophy. This is authoritarian will to power dressed up in the stolen language of liberty. Some EU officials believe the US is using free speech as a pressure point to cow the bloc into softening its regulation of technology platforms. And of course, that's exactly what's happening, because we can read the subtext here. When Trump says Europe is going in some bad directions, what he means is that Europe is refusing to let American billionaires operate without accountability. And when he says it's very bad for the people, he means it's very bad for the profits of his oligarch allies, who have spent hundreds of millions of dollars ensuring his political success. The grotesque irony is that European officials argue the issue is about ensuring social media companies take steps to mitigate disinformation and foreign interference that undermine electoral integrity and civil discourse, while Musk, who held a conversation with far-right leader Weidel that Germany monitored as a potential campaign finance violation, has often used his platform to promote misinformation, with immigration and voter fraud becoming his most frequently posted and engaged with policy topic, garnering about 10 billion views. This is the person Trump is defending, someone who uses his ownership of a major communications platform to spread conspiracy theories and boost fascist movements across multiple continents. The endgame here is terrifying because if Trump succeeds in bullying Europe into backing down from the Digital Services Act, it won't just be a defeat for European democracy. It will be a signal to authoritarians and oligarchs everywhere that democratic governance can be overridden by threats of economic retaliation, and that there is no checking the power of platform monopolists. The EU's choice is stark. Ignore digital service laws, allowing Musk and Zuckerberg's platforms free rein to propagate disinformation, hate speech and political interference, or suffer substantial economic repercussions and security risks. This is a hostage situation where democracy itself is the hostage, and we cannot allow the hostage takers to win. We need to understand that this fight over the Digital Services Act is actually about something much more fundamental than regulatory policy. It's about whether democratic publics can assert any control whatsoever over the algorithmic systems that increasingly mediate all of our social, political, and economic life. These platforms are not neutral infrastructure. They are designed systems that embody particular values and serve particular interests, and the question is whether those values and interests will be determined democratically or plutocratically. The semantic conflation of curatorial responsibility and censorship, a familiar domestic political gambit, has been internationalized and weaponized to attack the expectation, at least in Europe, that media platforms like Meta should practice responsible content curation, and we need to reject this conflation entirely, because requiring platforms to take responsibility for the foreseeable harms their systems cause is not censorship, it's accountability. The vision that Trump and Musk are articulating here, where platforms should be able to operate globally without regard to local democratic decisions about acceptable conduct, is a vision of corporate sovereignty that supersedes national sovereignty. It's neoliberalism on steroids, the idea that capital mobility and corporate power should be the supreme values that trump all others, including democracy, equality, and human dignity. And notice how this vision only flows in one direction. American tech companies should be free to operate in Europe without following European rules, but there's never any suggestion that European companies should be free to operate in America without following American rules, or that China should be free to export its tech platforms without restriction. The freedom being defended here is very specifically the freedom of American capital to dominate global markets without democratic constraint. What makes this particularly galling is that the Commission denied any connection between the trade negotiations with the U.S. and the implementation of its technology rulebooks, any targeting of American firms, or any kind of infringement on freedom of expression. But of course Trump and his allies refuse to take this at face value because their entire worldview requires them to be perpetual victims of persecution, even as they wield unprecedented power. The victim complex here is itself a form of authoritarianism, this idea that any limitation on your ability to do whatever you want constitutes oppression, this complete inability to distinguish between accountability and persecution. It's the mindset of a toddler with nuclear weapons, and we're supposed to pretend it's a coherent political philosophy. This is the moment where we need to decide what kind of digital future we want, and what kind of democracy we believe is possible in the 21st century. Do we want a world where a handful of billionaires control the infrastructure of public discourse and use that control to advance their political and economic interests without any democratic oversight? Or do we want a world where democratic publics can establish rules for how platforms must operate if they want access to our markets and our citizens? The European Union has chosen the latter path, and they're being threatened with economic warfare for that choice. Europe must decouple discussions about digital platform regulation from trade policy and security concerns, and should the US impose tariffs, the EU has tools to defend itself and should use them decisively. This is not the time for capitulation. This is the time for principled resistance. We should also recognize the profound cynicism of Trump's sudden concern for tech companies, given that after the January 6 insurrection, Facebook along with Twitter suspended Donald Trump's account, with Trump saying they shouldn't be allowed to get away with this censoring and silencing, and accusing Zuckerberg of plotting against him, writing in a 2024 book that the Meta CEO could spend the rest of his life in prison. But now that Meta's 2025 policy switch has been met with the new president's approval, suddenly tech companies are allies to be defended rather than enemies to be destroyed. The principle here isn't complicated. Trump supports whatever serves Trump's interests in any given moment. And right now his interests align with protecting tech oligarchs from democratic accountability, because those tech oligarchs have become his most important allies in the project of authoritarian restoration. This is why Trump's comment that he hasn't spoken to Elon about this yet but will get a full report is so chilling, because it suggests that American foreign and trade policy will be conducted for the personal benefit of the president's billionaire friends. We're not talking about defending American interests broadly construed. We're talking about using American state power to protect Elon Musk specifically from having to follow the law in countries where he wants to do business. This is corruption so naked that we've almost lost the ability to be shocked by it. But we need to recover that capacity for shock, because this is genuinely unprecedented in the scope of its brazenness. The path forward here requires us to recognize that this is not a debate to be won through better arguments or more persuasive rhetoric, because the other side isn't arguing in good faith. Trump and Musk aren't making a principled case for free speech absolutism. They're exercising power in defense of their interests and using whatever rhetorical weapons come to hand. The response cannot be more debate. It has to be more power, which means building the political coalitions and institutional capacity to resist techno-authoritarianism, both in America and globally. It means supporting the European Union in this fight, even though it's far from our borders, because what's at stake is a model of democratic platform governance that could inspire reforms everywhere. It means recognizing that tech regulation is not some wonky side issue, but actually central to the survival of democracy in the digital age. We are living through a hinge moment in history where the shape of the future digital public sphere is being determined, and the forces arrayed against democratic accountability are powerful and well-resourced and utterly shameless. But they're not invincible, and the fact that they're reacting with such fury to the Digital Services Act suggests that they understand something important, that once one jurisdiction successfully establishes democratic control over platform conduct, others will follow, and the era of tech exceptionalism will end. Trump's bluster about Europe going in bad directions is the sound of oligarchic panic, and while we should take the threat seriously, we should also recognize it as a sign that our side is winning. The fight is far from over, but every day that Europe stands firm in defense of the Digital Services Act is a day that moves us closer to a future where democracy can survive and flourish in the digital age, and that's worth fighting for with everything we have.